to say, first of all, thank you all for being here tonight. Having not enough chairs for the audience is a kind of problem that most musicians, let alone most contemporary composers, wish they had. So this really makes my day to know that we are challenging the very regulations of Nashville's fire code. So to that end, thank you for being here at my recital entitled Scoring the Revolution. That first piece you heard was for the Chinese suona. It's a double-reeded instrument distantly related to the oboe and the shawm. As you can tell, it has quite a distinctive sound, and that piece was a study piece of the various pitch bend techniques that the suona can do. Throughout this recital, I will not take offense if I see you looking at your phone. I will presume you're reading the program notes, where you can find out much more about the pieces on the program. But to get to the first part of this, the lecture component, where I actually hope some people in the room learn something tonight. It's, Chinese music history. How interesting can it be? But I think, to start off, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm actually doing this as a lecture recital in the first place. Why am I trying to get y'all to take something away from this? First of all, there's a purely scholarly component. This is for the music academia nerds in the room. I trust that most of the people here, you have no interest in this, and that's totally okay. But there's a very large gap in the English language scholarship about certain topics in Chinese music, particularly 20th century Chinese music. Those two that I've identified deal with essentially the cultural appropriation of non-Han Chinese ethnic minority musics by Han Chinese composers in the 20th century as part of a wider political agenda. Secondly, there is a dearth of scholarship on Taiwanese political music. We love to talk about the East is Red and the March of the Volunteers, but there's not enough attention given to the various memorial songs for the Jiang family or all of these opposing the communist tunes. Secondly, it's an artistic goal. As those of you who follow classical music might know, it's a field dominated by dead white men from Germany, mostly. Throw in some Italians, throw in some French for diversity. To that end, though, there is a dearth of Chinese classical music from the 20th century programmed in American concert halls, and it's music that I think personally is worthwhile, and I hope by listening to a little bit of tonight, you'll agree with me. To that end, in the United States, there is an unholy trinity of 3 works that are overrepresented, and I also think that by digging into the history, we will uncover some of the works that should be performed but are not. Lastly, and I think this is the most politically prescient issue, and to the many faces in the room who I recognize who we've talked about our shared heritage from either mainland China or Taiwan, being Chinese in the present day and age is a bit of a controversial thing. I don't want to go into a political science lecture right now, but it's tense. We can all feel it. We all know it. The United States Congress just passed an aid package to send guns to East Asia. I won't comment on the efficacy of that policy, but it's an acknowledgement that being Chinese in the present day and age is a controversial thing, even when it shouldn't be. And my opinion is firmly that to make it less controversial, we shouldn't ignore the actual elements of controversy in our shared past. Rather, we should acknowledge them, lean into them, and be willing to discuss them frankly and with a great deal of knowledge about the subject so that we're being sensitive to all involved. To that end, though, just to give you a rundown of the lecture component a little bit more, I'll first be discussing that issue of cultural appropriation that I mentioned beforehand. How Han Chinese composers essentially absorbed all sorts of cultural traditions into the umbrella of Chinese classical music, even when the people involved might not have called themselves Chinese 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. Secondly, discussing, I think, the most well-known element of middle and late 20th century Chinese music, the propaganda songs. This is your classics like The East is Red. It's where you see portraits of Mao Zedong or Chiang Kai-shek hung over the Forbidden City and hear a song playing in the background. That's what we get coming to mind. And then lastly, a case study on the Yellow River Piano Concerto, one of the most programmed works of Chinese classical music in the United States and Western Europe, and how politically, music wasn't just a domestic agenda for Chinese composers in the Chinese states in the middle and late 20th century, but it was an international way of building support for their worldview and their way of looking at things. It wasn't just about the people at home, but the people across the sea as well. So to start, I know it's a little faint with our projection setup, but this is a map from National Geographic of China at the turn of the 20th century. And if you'll squint your eyes, you can see two distinct areas. There's an area shaded in pink, and then there's all the regions around that, That area in pink is what in the West is referred to as China proper. It's regions inhabited primarily by Han Chinese people and the more closely related ethnic minorities. This is the area of China that if you looked at all the imperial dynasties and averaged their territory, you would get something that roughly corresponds to this. All the other regions, Tibet and Xinjiang in the west, Mongolia in the north, Manchuria in the northeast, and Taiwan in the east, they're part of China, but historically have been contested, have been home to different people who would not have called themselves Chinese, and have at various times tried to either fight for their independence or been claimed as another nation's territory. At the turn of the 20th century, and then going into the early 20th century, as China turned from imperial dynasty to modern nation state, you had a country that was trying to figure out what it was. Was it China proper, or was it this expansive version of the Chinese nation that included all of these primarily non-Han Chinese minority regions? To that end, Chinese composers were not silent in this debate, and in fact, many of them, in their search for a Chinese sound, Chinese music, music with national character, it was called, turned to the ethnic traditions of these minority populations. One composer would borrow from Inner Mongolia on one day, and then Tibet on the next, and then Taiwan on another one, write it into a piece, and call it a Chinese piece of music, a piece with Chinese national character. Some of us who are a little more familiar with American musical history might be familiar with like Dvorak and Gershwin, folks who appropriated or borrowed or mingled with the musical traditions of African Americans and indigenous people and tried to bring their traditions into American classical music. I would say that this is roughly analogous to that, but with a more hidden political undertone because, as you may know, China throughout the 20th century was dominated by authoritarian regimes of Han Chinese rulers. For lack of better words, it's Han Chinese composers going to these regions and one-sidedly saying, this music is now Chinese music. This people are part of the Chinese nation, so thus when we use their music, we are using Chinese music. No questions about independence or autonomy. I think the thing that makes this really interesting is you can just look at the one life of one particular composer. So this is the famed violin composer Ma Zedong, just a selection of his works, and I'll walk you through them. The first work, the first rondo, seems kind of innocuous, right? First rondo, it's very European sounding. He acknowledged, though, in some of his writings that this borrows from Inner Mongolian and Uyghur folk suites. Inner Mongolian suite, pretty self-explanatory, Inner Mongolia, right? Tibetan tone poem, same deal, borrowing or appropriating from Tibet. The pastoral, it's a similar thing where you might think, oh, this is just a generic conjured image of pastoral, nomadic life. But scholarship mostly recognizes that he was, again, borrowing from Turkic peoples of China's northwest and appropriating their musical techniques and traditions into this work. The Xinjiang Rhapsody, again, self-explanatory, Xinjiang. And then I really want to draw attention to the last two pieces on this list here, the Ame Suite and the Gaoshan Suite. Ma Zedong has a very interesting career, wherein he starts in mainland China, teaches at the Central Conservatory in Beijing, before being exiled during the Cultural Revolution to Hong Kong and then having an international life in Taiwan and eventually even sometime in the United States. These last two works come after he has been exiled from the mainland, and in fact are produced after being essentially toured around Taiwan by the Kuomintang government in the island. I think that's the really interesting thing here. While he's in the mainland, he's writing about the regions of China that are threatened by the Soviet Union, Tibetan independence, Mongolian separatism. But as soon as he goes to Taiwan, the subject changes to Taiwanese indigenous peoples. So Ame and Gaoshan are kind of generic terms referring to different indigenous populations in Taiwan. It shows that this is not just a kind of ambiguous, oh, we want to assimilate all these peoples in, but when there's some degree of influence from the government, composers are writing music that fits a governmental agenda. So in the case of the Taiwanese government, Isn't it great that a Chinese composer is writing an Ame suite or a Gaoshan suite, Chinese classical music about these indigenous peoples in an island that we didn't even really fully own, until 30 years ago? It's part of an agenda of building an expansive version of the Chinese nation. And it's something that actually remains in the scholarship today, both in the English language, but I won't start scholarly fights here and name names. That can be homework for anyone interested. There are plenty of people who commit this faux pas. But in the Chinese language scholarship, there's been this attitude of, as I put it here, a unitary, multi-ethnic Chinese nation with 5,000 years of unbroken history. When, if you go and tally it all up, there's probably a lot of time where China is not exactly unbroken, or it's not exactly unitary. Even so, especially in mainland Chinese scholarship, composers and scholars of this music will still talk about how this all fits into a tradition of a unitary and multi-ethnic Chinese nation, one that is expansive and one that is broad, and encouraging composers of the future to continue doing this. It's a project aimed at building a Chinese nation that includes the Uyghurs, that includes the Tibetans, and includes them, though, in a way that isn't very satisfying because it's Han Chinese composers writing their story at the end of the day. We're going to have a quick musical interlude, so this is going to be Autumn Harvest Dance that's mentioned in the program. I'll be welcoming Albert to the piano. I think just a quick note about this piece is that it treads the line of appropriating ethnic minority and Han Chinese traditions, because the traditions it's written about are vague, ambiguous, and belong to multiple peoples. So it very much is, who is this about? Is it about the people of the Western frontier or the Han Chinese people right next door? And it treads that ambiguity, I think, much to its rhetorical effect. So let me grab my saxophone and we'll get into that. So on to what we could consider the fun part. If fun for you is totalitarianism, one-party states, communism, authoritarianism, the whole basket. So I don't mean to play, both-sidism. It's something that I think a lot of us are tired of in today's politics, but I do want to emphasize something here. Even though I talk a lot more about the mainland and the Communist Party of China, this is a phenomenon happening both in Taiwan with the GMD and in the mainland with the CCP. And I think the political propagandic music, something that we might not always hear in a concert hall, is one avenue to really see this. Both the Communist Party and the Nationalists, the GMD, as I'm abbreviating them here, they both utilized propagandic music for some of the same purposes. They wanted to bolster authoritarian one-party states where there was only one legal party and that party would lead the nation unquestionably. They both sought to construct cults of personality around their respective leaders. So Mao Zedong, the famous Chairman Mao, or Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. And lastly, they also used music, interestingly enough, to reclaim older pieces of art, and make them politically palatable in their present day. And that's something I'll discuss more when I get to the yellow River Piano Concerto. So, small text, I know, but the East is Red, probably one of the most famous instances of propagandic music from the Cultural Revolution. And I think it's something that gets maybe a little lost on Americans because, we have the national anthem, but the national anthem isn't talking about how George Washington is the savior of democracy or how Joe Biden is leading us to victory over fascism. This type of music is explicitly like that, and it saturates the airwaves. You can imagine any radio, any broadcast system, any concert hall, you hear this in it. This text would be something that you knew, and you know, I hate to admit it, the tune is kind of catchy. So it gets stuck in your head, and the text it's associated with also does as well. So I have a very nice YouTube video prepared by someone anonymously online with some glamour shots of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party that will correspond to this text. And I think just to give you an idea of what it sounds like and what you'd be listening to with this lyrics. The Communist Party is like the sun, and Mao Zedong is the people's great savior. There's not a lot of room for ambiguity there, right? Again, to illustrate the fact that this is not just a communist thing. This is the Chiang Kai-shek memorial song, written and published after Chiang Kai-shek had died and leadership of the KMT and Taiwan had been taken over by his son, Jiang Jingguo. It's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Just with a nationalist spin on it this time around. Comparing him to the Great Wall, saying that he will lead the Chinese nation into its future endeavors. And mind you, this is after he has died. So even in death, the cult of personality knows no rest. Once you've gotten some time to take that in. Another video with some glamour shots of Chiang Kai-shek in military attire. Unfortunately, no English translation, but I think you'll get the idea. Both sides were kind of at the same game, and you can see why. They were opponents in a brutal civil war, and to this day have not formally resolved that matter. I mean, this is why we hear about supposedly one China. And I think this comes at a very interesting geopolitical moment, not just between the United States and mainland China, but just last week, the Taiwanese government, re-elected in the most recent general election, announced that they're going to be taking down a lot of the memorials to Chiang Kai-shek that are left up in the country. I was reading an article just last year about a bit of a spat that occurred because some veterans of the Republic of China or Taiwan Army had been singing this at a memorial function. And people kind of questioned, is this appropriate in the present day and age? I think we can all relate to that because we go through similar fits and spatters here in the United States. And I think it goes to show just how ingrained in a consciousness this type of memory can become. In addition to that, how the art, the music, the political implications of all that music can be remembered by a generation as something they're fond of, even if they might know intellectually that this is also a time of repression, of authoritarianism, of a lot of bad stuff. And it's that dichotomy that I think makes up a lot of Chinese experience of a certain generation. For example, my mother came over to the United States as a result of Tiananmen Square, and that's how she got her green card. Good and bad in that. She got a green card out of it, but it means that China was forever changed in that sense. Lastly, I think part of this lecture component is I want to talk about the Yellow River Piano Concerto. It's one of, I'll admit, my favorite pieces of Chinese classical repertoire, and also one of the most, in my opinion, overperformed pieces of Chinese classical repertoire, but also one that has a tremendous amount of political implication to its composition and its performance. So originally, essentially instigated by pianist and composer Yin Chengzong requesting a new work for piano and orchestra that would make the piano acceptable in Chinese concert halls. The idea won the approval of Jiang Qing, otherwise known as Madame Mao in the popular Western imagination, the wife of Mao Zedong. She was the leader of the hardline Gang of Four. If you know any of the scholarship or discussions about the Cultural Revolution, they are the ones blamed for the biggest excesses of Cultural Revolution era, for lack of better words, violence and overindulgence and revolutionary zeal. To that end, though, she signs off on the idea, and a committee of composers appointed by the Chinese state get together to not compose an original work, but take the work of a previous composer, Xian Xinghai's Yellow River Cantata, written during the Second World War, and essentially update it, renovate it, redo it in a way that Xian Xinghai's really great piece of classical music can service the Cultural Revolution ideology. In the end, Xian Xinghai died in 1945, so he had no say in this matter. But the party still wanted to use his stuff, so they said, okay, what do? Let's do it over. Use his melodies, but reorchestrate the thing to sound more like the modern version of communist music that we want. Because I know visuals are oh so important. Some portraits to help you remember these folks. Xian Xinghai, the young man on the left there who died young and was the composer of the Yellow River Cantata. Yin Chengzong, the revolutionary pianist who is known for, again, his kind of looks and revolutionary zeal, who instigated the whole creation of the work. And lastly, Jiang Qing herself, Madame Mao, the Gang of Four leader who helped curate the work's creation. So to that end, the work was composed in 1969 and premiered in 1970. It originally premiered in China, but very quickly gained an international following due to the geopolitical circumstances of the time. So the nations I list second there, Albania, Yugoslavia, Romania, all communist states, but ones that had essentially their disagreements with the Soviet Union, to put it lightly. And I think it's interesting and something to consider that the first place that this concerto goes after China, which itself had a split with the Soviet Union about a decade or two before, are these other communist nations that are still socialistic. They still are one-party states, but they're not quite Soviet communism. It's this brotherhood of communist nations, the Internationale, but not the Soviet one. To that end, though, it eventually makes its way to the United States in 1973 under the baton of Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra as part of this Nixon in China episode, the détente between the mainland Chinese government and the United States as a way of countering Soviet influence. And to that end, explicitly, commentators in the United States call the performance of the work musical détente. They recognize that this is a communist concerto. This is everything we should abhor. And the fact that audiences love the communist concerto, they'll give it a standing ovation, that's really bad. Put it lightly. But they also recognize that this is a geopolitical thing. This is about showing that these two nations can get along. And in fact, when the Philadelphia Orchestra goes to China, they perform the work there as well as in their own concert hall in the United States. I want to wrap this up, though, by saying that I think some of this might seem a little in the abstract, insofar that oh, how communist can a work be? You know, without like text and a choir singing it at us, Mao Zedong is great. Can we really tell that a piece is communist? And I understand that fear. It's something I've been questioned about in my own scholarship on the topic, is how much did the people listening to this piece take away that it's about Maoism and communism? And I'll just play the next video, I think, without a ton of context. Just know that the portrait you're about to see is a young Mao Zedong, maybe one that you've not seen before. By the way, that's a quote of "The Very East is Red" we just heard, you know, a couple of minutes ago. And I think it emphasizes that to the people who composed the work, they understood the problem that this message might be lost on some folks. So how do we make sure that there's no question about what this piece is about? Well, you hang a portrait of Mao Zedong in the concert hall over the orchestra to remind the folks at home that even in a classical music concert, Mao Zedong is still there. The Communist Party is still there. You hear it in your ears, you see it with your eyes, and you receive it as a viewer. I mean, I think it's fair to say this is a pretty jarring clip because we wouldn't imagine like something like that in a Western concert hall in the present day, but it goes to show that the composers of the time were acutely aware, and the curators of the time were acutely aware of the political impact of music, and they knew and tried every way possible to make sure that you took that away, that there was no question what this music was about. If you're wondering why I'm not mentioning Taiwanese music here, I will simply admit, because of musical détente, the Yellow River Piano Concerto takes off, but similar Taiwanese works don't. That's why we don't have as many well-known Taiwanese composed classical works from the same time period in the United States. But I encourage you to go out and find them because they're worth listening to. The Yellow River Piano Concerto, though, and similar works, go to show just how political it gets, though. And the fact that this is one of the most performed works in the United States goes to show that, I'll clarify, I don't think we should not program it. It's a great work, it gets stuck in your ear, it's fun to listen to. But we should also acknowledge what we're talking about here. This is not composed in a vacuum, it was not created in a vacuum, and people don't remember it in a vacuum. I mean, I have a story from one Chinese professor at this university, actually. I told her I was working on this project and about the Yellow River Piano Concerto, and the first thing she said was, well, she hummed a bit of the tune to make sure it was the same piece that we were talking about, and then followed it up with this quotation. Mao made China stand up, Deng made China rich, as in Deng Xiaoping, and Xi, as in Xi Jinping, the current leader, is making China strong. The fact that hearing about this piece and that quotation and that sentiment were so interlinked goes to show how people still remember this type of thing. We need to be aware of these connotations when programming, when talking, when discussing these works, because if we're not, we're walking blindly into a, for lack of better words, a minefield that we know nothing about.